The vampire story did not begin in Transylvania. Long before castles loomed in shadow, long before Vlad the Impaler stained the earth with blood, humanity already whispered of creatures that fed upon life itself. The fear of the undead is as old as civilization itself, carved into clay tablets, etched into rituals, and sung in lullabies meant to keep children safe from the night. 4,000 years ago, under the burning sun and fertile soil of Mesopotamia, people believed the darkness was alive. Every illness, every infant that failed to wake, every withered crop was explained not by chance, but by the malice of unseen forces. Out of this fear rose demons, monstrous spirits who hungered for human blood. The most dreaded was Lamashtu, the night terror of mothers. They said she crept into homes under moonlight, strangled babies in their cradles, and drank their blood. To ward her off, amulets were carved and prayers were whispered into the silence of the night. Then there was Lilitu, a restless spirit, described as a woman with the beauty of a temptress and the hunger of a predator. She slipped into men's dreams, draining their strength with each encounter. Lilitu was desire and death woven together, the earliest shadow of the seductive vampire who would haunt European imagination centuries later. For the Mesopotamians, blood was life itself, the divine essence of the gods. To consume it was unthinkable, a crime against nature. And yet in their stories, there were beings who did just that. The pattern was already there, creatures of the night, feeding on blood, unstoppable and merciless. Centuries later, the Greeks inherited these fears and gave them new form. They believed the dead could rise if wronged in life, if buried improperly, or if their souls were too stained by sin. These corpses, called vrikolakas, stumbled from their graves to torment the living. The Greeks also spoke of the Strigoi, women who transformed into screeching owls and sucked the blood of infants. Roman poets later echoed these tales, describing the Strigoi as winged horrors that descended on villages in the dead of night. Mothers learned to fear not just silence, but the sound of flapping wings outside their windows. To stop the dead from rising, the Greeks pinned corpses with stones and iron spikes. Graves were sealed with wax or bound with holy charms. In some villages, bodies were burned to ash, their remains scattered so no spirit could rise again. It was not simply ritual, it was desperation. For the Greeks, death was never guaranteed to be final. The Romans carried these fears with them. Festivals like Lemuria were devoted to appeasing the angry spirits of the dead. Families would walk through their homes at midnight, tossing black beans behind them, whispering, "With these beans I redeem me and mine." They believed the spirits would collect the offerings and leave the living in peace. Writers described bodies that refused to decay, corpses that twitched after burial, and revenants that walked among the living demanding blood. To the Romans, death was not a closed door, it was a fragile barrier, one that could be broken by hunger, rage, or injustice. But beneath these myths lay a darker truth. Ancient people lived side by side with death. Plagues struck without warning, sweeping through cities, killing entire families in days. Corpses sometimes looked fresh, even lifelike, long after burial. Blood often seeped from the mouths of the dead during decomposition. To the frightened villager standing over a half-decayed body, it looked as though the corpse had been feeding in the night. Without science to explain these horrors, they turned to stories. They gave the dead names, motives, and appetites. They called them demons, witches, revenants. We call them vampires. Blood was life, and where blood flowed, fear followed. From Mesopotamian demons that preyed on infants, to Greek shadows clawing free from their graves, to Roman spirits demanding offerings in the dark, humanity learned a terrifying lesson. The dead were never truly gone. They lingered. They waited. The ancients carved their warnings into stone, whispered them in songs, and buried their dead with chains, spikes, and fire. Yet still the stories endured, clinging to the world like shadows that never faded. And as centuries passed, those shadows traveled into the heart of Europe, where villages were swallowed by mist and forests stretched endless and dark. There the vampire was no longer a legend, but a neighbor rising from the grave to feed. The Carpathian mountains rise like jagged teeth, their peaks wrapped in mist, their valleys heavy with silence. For centuries, the people who lived in their shadow carried a burden heavier than hunger or war, the belief that the dead might not stay buried. Here in the isolated villages of Romania, Transylvania, and the Balkans, the vampire was not a distant myth. It was a neighbor, a relative, a loved one who returned from the grave with hunger in their eyes. They called them Strigoi, and they lived in constant fear of their return. Unlike the elegant aristocrats of modern tales, the Strigoi were far more unsettling. They were ordinary people who, after death, rose again in twisted, corrupted form. Some Strigoi were described as pale and bloated, their bodies unnaturally preserved. Others appeared gaunt and shadowy, slipping through villages unseen, leaving livestock drained of blood and families wasting away with sickness. What made the Strigoi truly terrifying was their familiarity. They were not strangers from a distant land. They were brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers, people known and loved in life. A husband might wake to find his deceased wife standing at the foot of the bed, lips red and eyes hollow, whispering his name. To the villagers, the line between grief and terror was razor thin. Because the threat was constant, the people of the Carpathians developed rituals barriers to keep the Strigoi at bay. Garlic was placed at windows and doorways, its pungent smell believed to drive away the dead. Salt was scattered across thresholds, forming an invisible boundary no spirit could cross. Iron stakes were driven into graves to pin corpses to the earth. If a villager suspected a Strigoi, the measures became more brutal. Corpses were exhumed and examined for signs of vampirism. Fresh blood at the mouth, rosy cheeks, limbs that remained supple instead of stiff. These were not seen as natural effects of decomposition, but proof that the corpse had been feeding. If suspicion was confirmed, the heart was pierced with a wooden or iron stake. In some cases, the body was decapitated, its head buried at a crossroads to confuse the spirit. Ashes from burned remains were sometimes mixed into water and drunk by survivors, a desperate attempt to protect the living by consuming what remained of the dead. These practices were not folklore performed in secret, they were communal events. Villages gathered in moonlight to dig up the graves of neighbors, chanting prayers as they destroyed the body. The rituals were as much about psychological relief as they were about protection. Only when the corpse was mutilated did the villagers believe their torment would end. Stories of the Strigoi spread across generations, carried in whispers around hearthfires. A shepherd might claim his flock was drained in the night, their throats torn open without a sound. A widow might insist her dead husband visited her, leaving her weaker each morning until she wasted away. One account tells of a girl who died suddenly and was buried at the edge of her village. Weeks later, children playing near her grave swore they saw her walking between the trees. When her body was dug up, it was found undecayed, her nails long and sharp, her mouth stained as though with blood. Terrified, the villagers cut out her heart, burned it to ash, and scattered the remains to the wind. These tales were not just stories, they were warnings, cultural memory that taught each generation what to fear and how to fight it. Belief in the Strigoi was woven into every aspect of daily life. A child born with deformities might be whispered to be cursed, destined to become one of the undead. People who died violently or without proper burial rites were considered at high risk of returning. Even living outcasts, witches, thieves, or the deeply unlucky were feared as potential Strigoi in waiting. The fear shaped communities. Families sometimes turned against their own dead, mutilating corpses to prevent their return. Mourning was mingled with suspicion. Love was poisoned by dread. In the Carpathians, grief did not end with burial, it lingered, transforming into paranoia that the one you buried might soon come knocking at your door. The Strigoi were not aristocrats in velvet cloaks, nor immortal lords of distant castles. They were something far more terrifying. They were familiar. They wore the faces of loved ones. They spoke with remembered voices, and they walked the same paths through the same villages. And when night fell, no lock, no prayer, no silence could guarantee safety. Families barred their doors, garlic lined their windows, and hearts raced at every knock in the dark. For in the Carpathians, The vampire was not a legend of the past. It was a living fear, an enemy that rose from the very soil of the grave. But the terror did not stay contained in these valleys. It spread, carried by rumor, by church reports, by the written word. Soon, all of Europe would tremble at the thought of vampires. For what began in the Carpathians as whispers of the Strigoi would erupt into something far greater, the vampire epidemics. The 18th century was not only an age of kings and empires, it was an age of hysteria. Across Europe, whispers spread like wildfire, villages haunted by unsettling visitations, families shaken by strange happenings, entire communities caught in a storm of fear. These were the so-called vampire epidemics, moments when folklore spilled into the courts of Europe and ignited an international panic. The first sparks of hysteria appeared in Eastern Europe. In Serbia, Moravia, and Poland, villagers claimed they were visited at night by figures they believed should have been at rest. Families insisted that loved ones returned, bringing sickness and dread. These stories were not just passed along in taverns. They were recorded by priests, investigated by soldiers, and carried by diplomats into the courts of Vienna, Paris, and London. Suddenly, the fears of remote valleys were being debated in the centers of Enlightenment Europe. One of the earliest outbreaks was reported in a small Serbian village in 1725. A man named Petar Blagojevic died suddenly, but rumors quickly spread that he was still being seen. Witnesses claimed he knocked on doors at night, asking for food, and that soon after misfortune followed those households. Fear escalated until his resting place was examined. Reports described his body as appearing unusually preserved, with features that seemed unchanged. Villagers were convinced he was a vampire. Rituals were carried out to bring peace, and the community believed the terror was over. The case was formally documented and spread across Europe, sparking both fascination and dread. Soon after, another outbreak in Serbia gained even more attention. In 1726, villagers accused a former soldier, Arnold Paole, of returning after his death. He had once claimed to have been attacked by a vampire during his service, and when he died suddenly, suspicion grew. Locals swore they saw him wandering at night, pale and restless. Illness spread through the community, and soon officials became involved. Reports said his body too seemed unchanged by time. Rituals were again performed, yet the unrest continued. Military doctors examined the events and published findings that astonished Europe. They declared vampirism a real possibility. The panic spread. Villages across Eastern and Central Europe began disturbing cemeteries and performing protective rites. Priests were overwhelmed with requests for blessings. Bishops wrote guides on identifying vampires. Even governments grew concerned. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria ordered an official investigation, sending her physician Gerard van Swieten to uncover the truth. Van Swieten, a man of reason, dismissed the tales as superstition. He explained that natural processes after burial could create illusions, bloating, shifting of features, even traces at the lips. But villagers trusted their eyes more than science. The vampire epidemics revealed a deep conflict in Europe between Enlightenment reason and centuries-old fear. Newspapers amplified the panic, publishing accounts that thrilled readers in Paris and London. For the first time, the vampire became more than local folklore. It became a European obsession. The hysteria eventually subsided, but the memory remained. Villages scarred by fear, communities forever altered, and the vampire transformed into something larger than legend, a figure of culture and imagination. And yet this was only the beginning, for while peasants fought shadows with rituals, another figure was rising in the east. A prince whose rule would become the perfect vessel for Europe's darkest fears. His name was Vlad. The land of Wallachia lay caught between empires. To the west, the mighty kingdom of Hungary. To the east, the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. And in the middle, a small principality ruled by fragile thrones and fragile men, until one prince carved his name into history with blood. His name was Vlad III of the House of Dracula, a man who would come to be known as Vlad the Impaler, and whose legend would fuel the myth of Dracula. Vlad's childhood was drenched in violence and betrayal. Born around 1431 in Transylvania, he entered the world at a time when his father, Vlad II Dracula, ruled Wallachia under constant threat of war. His father's name, Dracula, meaning dragon, came from his membership in the chivalric Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottoman Turks. But to the villagers, Dracula also carried another meaning: the devil. From birth, Vlad bore the legacy of both dragon and demon. When he was still a boy, his father pledged him and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the Ottoman Empire. It was a gesture of loyalty, meant to ensure Wallachia would not rebel. For years, Vlad lived under Ottoman watch, studying their tactics, learning their language, and absorbing both cruelty and cunning. Captivity hardened Vlad. He witnessed impalements, beheadings, and brutal punishments meant to terrify enemies into submission. Yet instead of breaking him, it shaped his philosophy. Fear was the strongest weapon a ruler could wield. When he returned to Wallachia as a young man, he carried this belief like a sword at his side. His early attempts to seize power were bloody and unstable. Wallachia was a land of shifting loyalties, where boyars, the powerful nobles, conspired endlessly, choosing and discarding rulers like pieces in a deadly game. Vlad survived assassination plots, betrayal and exile, but each time he clawed his way back to the throne, he did so with more determination to rule by fear. By the mid-1450s, Vlad secured his rule, and almost immediately he unleashed a reign that terrified friend and foe alike. He declared war not just on invaders, but on corruption within his own land. Boyars who conspired against him were executed in gruesome public spectacles. Entire families were impaled as warnings. Merchants who cheated the poor found themselves dangling from stakes outside the marketplace. Vlad's cruelty was calculated. He believed terror was justice and justice was order. Where others saw brutality, he saw control. Villages that once trembled with lawlessness became quiet under his iron grip. Thieves disappeared, crimes dropped, and the roads grew safe, but only because no one dared defy the prince who ruled through fear. The most infamous act of Vlad's reign came in 1462, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia with an army numbering in the tens of thousands. Facing overwhelming odds, Vlad fought with guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids, and a daring night attack that nearly killed the Sultan himself. But his true masterpiece of terror was not on the battlefield. It was in the aftermath. As Mehmed's forces advanced, they came upon a sight that froze even hardened soldiers, a forest of 20,000 corpses impaled on towering stakes. Men, women, even children, all displayed in grotesque rows, swaying in the wind like macabre banners of resistance. The Sultan recoiled. His army faltered. For a moment, fear defeated numbers. Vlad had weaponized horror itself. To his people, Vlad was both savior and monster. To his enemies, he was a nightmare given flesh. He ruled with cruelty beyond measure, yet he carved stability into a land that had known only chaos. His legend spread across Europe, carried in chronicles and travelers' tales, each more exaggerated than the last. But legends are dangerous things. They grow, twist, and evolve long after the man is gone. And for Vlad, the stories of his cruelty would one day merge with the whispers of vampires, creating a figure who was more than mortal, more than history, a creature of fear eternal. For though Vlad the Impaler lived and died as a man, his shadow was only beginning to rise. The line between man and monster is never clear. For Vlad the Impaler, his cruelty in life ensured he would never rest in peace. But legends do not die, they transform. And in the shadowy halls of imagination, his story was about to become something far greater: the birth of Dracula. Even while Vlad still lived, his cruelty was carried by rumor across Europe. German pamphlets among the earliest forms of mass media circulated lurid tales of his brutality. They described a prince who roasted children alive, who forced mothers to eat their own infants, who feasted among forests of impaled bodies. These pamphlets, illustrated with grotesque woodcuts, spread like wildfire among a European public hungry for both horror and moral lessons. To Vlad's enemies, he was a monster whose crimes defied imagination. To his allies, he was a necessary evil, a ruler who did what was required to hold back the tide of the Ottomans. But stories are never neutral. Once released, they grow in ways no man can control, and soon Vlad's cruelty became inseparable from the supernatural. In the Carpathians, villagers already whispered of the Strigoi, the restless dead who fed upon the living. When the tales of Vlad's impalement spread, they fused with older fears. To the common folk, Vlad was no longer merely a prince, he was a Strigoi in human flesh, a man who drank blood not from necessity, but from desire. Accounts described him dipping bread into the blood of his victims, savoring it as though it were wine. Whether true or fabricated, these details became part of his legacy. The man and the myth blurred. Vlad was both ruler and revenant, his cruelty too inhuman to belong to mortal men alone. The key to the transformation lay in Vlad's name. His father, Vlad II Dracula, had earned his title from the Order of the Dragon, a Christian knightly society sworn to defend against the Turks. Dracula meant the dragon, but in Romanian it also carried another meaning, the devil. Vlad inherited the name, becoming known as Dracula, the son of the dragon or the son of the devil. In a culture steeped in fear of the undead, the name itself was enough to mark him as something other than human. To his enemies, it was a curse. To storytellers, it was destiny. As the printing press carried lurid tales into Germany and Italy, Vlad's legend grew darker. Chroniclers described him not only as cruel, but as otherworldly. One German account claimed that he never ate like ordinary men, preferring instead to feast on blood. Italian writers compared him to ancient tyrants, monsters dressed as kings. In an age where literacy was spreading but superstition remained strong, these accounts were taken as truth. Vlad became a cautionary tale, proof of what happened when a ruler abandoned humanity. He was not simply feared, he was mythologized. Centuries later, in Victorian England, a writer named Bram Stoker searched for inspiration for a Gothic villain. He found fragments of history whispers of a Wallachian prince named Dracula, tales of cruelty and records of blood. Stoker wove these fragments into something new, a count who was not merely cruel, but immortal. A vampire who lived in castles, crossed oceans and preyed upon the innocent. The Count Dracula of Stoker's imagination was not the same man as Vlad the Impaler, but the seed had been planted by centuries of rumor and folklore. Without Vlad, the name might never have echoed across the world. Without Vlad, the vampire might have remained in village whispers. The birth of Dracula was not the work of a single writer, nor a single story. It was the slow accumulation of terror across centuries, the real cruelty of a prince, the whispered fears of villagers, the pamphlets of enemies, the myths of Strigoi, and finally, the imagination of a Victorian novelist. Out of blood and rumor, man and myth became one. Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia, stepped into the shadows of history and emerged as Dracula, a creature who would never die, a symbol of fear eternal. And yet, the story did not end there. For once Dracula had been born on the page, he would take on new forms, shifting with every generation, haunting not just Europe, but the entire world. The vampire was already centuries old when he found his truest form in literature. But it was in the flicker of candlelight and the turning of pages that Dracula was reborn, not as a prince of Wallachia, but as the world's most enduring monster. The 19th century was an age obsessed with death. Industrial progress filled cities with smoke, but behind polished facades lay poverty, disease, and fear of the grave. This was the age of Gothic fiction stories filled with crumbling castles, forbidden desires, and horrors that crept from the shadows. Writers like John Polidori introduced the idea of the vampire as aristocrat in The Vampire, 1819, a tale of a nobleman who charmed by day and killed by night. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1872, gave the vampire a new face, seductive, feminine, and hauntingly modern. Each story polished the image, preparing the world for the creature that would outlive them all. In 1897, Bram Stoker unveiled Dracula, and the world was never the same. His count was not merely a monster, he was an immortal predator who walked among men in disguise, hiding his hunger behind noble manners. Stoker drew on fragments of Eastern European folklore, on whispers of Vlad the Impaler, and on centuries of superstition. The result was a vampire who embodied both ancient terror and modern sophistication. Stoker's Dracula was a parasite of more than blood. He represented invasion, disease, lust, and the fear of the foreign. In Victorian England, where anxieties about sexuality and empire simmered beneath the surface, Dracula was every nightmare wrapped in one figure, exotic, powerful, and corrupting. The book was not an instant bestseller, but it endured. Slowly, word by word, it seeped into the imagination of the world. The early 20th century brought new life to Stoker's Count. Stage adaptations turned Dracula into a spectacle of shadow and fear. In London and New York, audiences watched as cloaked figures appeared on foggy sets, their presence commanding silence. It was here that the image of Dracula as we know him began to crystallize. The aristocrat in black, the hypnotic gaze, the voice that lured victims closer. By the time cinema arrived, the vampire was ready to step from the stage into immortality. In 1922, the German film Nosferatu reimagined Dracula as a grotesque figure, bald, clawed, and rat-like, spreading plague through silent cities. Though nearly destroyed by lawsuits, the film survived, becoming one of the great horror classics. A decade later, Bela Lugosi brought Dracula to life in Hollywood. His deep accent, piercing eyes, and iconic line, "I never drink wine," cemented Dracula as more than a monster. He was charisma and menace entwined. Audiences across the world fell under his spell. From that moment on, Dracula belonged not just to folklore, but to pop culture. He became a figure of fascination, endlessly adaptable, haunting black and white films, comic books, radio shows, and pulp novels. Every generation has reinvented Dracula in its own image. In the Hammer horror films of the 1950s and 60s, Christopher Lee's Dracula was feral, violent, and sensual, reflecting a post-war world grappling with new freedoms and fears. Later, writers like Anne Rice transformed vampires into tragic, romantic figures, immortal but burdened with guilt. Movies like Interview with the Vampire and series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer reframed Dracula's descendants as metaphors for alienation, desire, and identity. And still, Dracula endured. From children's cartoons to graphic novels, from video games to blockbuster films, the vampire refused to die. His coffin opened again and again, each time revealing a face shaped for a new age. What makes Dracula immortal is not his fangs, nor his thirst for blood, it is his ability to adapt. In every era, he becomes what humanity fears most. In Stoker's time, he was foreign invasion and forbidden sexuality. In the age of pandemics, he symbolized disease. In the modern world, he is greed, addiction, or the hunger for power. Dracula is a mirror held up to our nightmares. He survives because we do. From the firesides of peasants to the presses of pamphlets, from the pen of Bram Stoker to the glowing screens of Hollywood, Dracula has walked with us for centuries. He has worn many faces: tyrant, monster, seducer, icon. Yet beneath every mask lies the same truth. Dracula is the fear that will not die. He is the shadow behind us, the hunger within us, the story we tell again and again. And as long as fear exists, Dracula will rise from his coffin, spreading his wings across literature, film, and culture, eternal, unending, and undead. The vampire is eternal not because he cannot die, but because we refuse to let him. Each generation has resurrected him, reshaping his fangs and cloak to reflect its deepest fears and desires. The vampire of the modern world is no longer confined to castles or crypts. He prowls nightclubs, boardrooms, and even teenage bedrooms. Yet behind every new disguise lies the same hunger, the endless thirst for life. By the late 20th century, the vampire underwent a transformation. No longer just a monster, he became tragic, complex, and perhaps most shocking, sympathetic. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, 1976, redefined the creature, portraying him as a tortured immortal, cursed to wander eternity with guilt and longing. Rice's vampires were seductive and sorrowful, more philosophers than predators. Her visions spread quickly. Readers saw themselves in her creatures, outsiders, misunderstood, cursed to live in a world that feared them. The vampire was no longer only a monster, it was a metaphor for alienation, addiction, and forbidden love. Hollywood seized upon this new archetype. In the 1990s, films like Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, and Interview with the Vampire, 1994, presented vampires as sensual, tragic figures, embodying both fear and desire. Television followed with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 1997-2003, where vampires became stand-ins for adolescence, temptation, and identity. By the early 2000s, the vampire was everywhere. Underworld blended vampire lore with action spectacle. True Blood draped them in Southern Gothic drama. And then came Twilight, which recast vampires as glittering immortals caught in teenage romance. Some derided it as a dilution of the myth, but it proved the vampire's versatility. Even stripped of horror, the archetype endured. Why does the vampire survive when so many monsters fade? Because it is infinitely adaptable. The vampire is not just a creature, it is a cultural mirror. In ages of plague, it was a symbol of disease. In times of war, it was invasion from the outside. In Victorian society, it represented forbidden sexuality. In the 20th century, it became alienation, addiction, and desire. In the 21st, it reflects consumerism, immortality fantasies, and our obsession with youth. The vampire changes because we change. It is our shadow following us wherever fear leads. Today, vampires have gone global. Japanese anime reimagines them as elegant anti-heroes. African cinema reinvents them within local folklore. Streaming platforms introduce them to new generations, each time with a different twist, sometimes terrifying, sometimes romantic, sometimes comedic. The result is a mythology no longer bound to Transylvania. Dracula may be the father of them all, but his children roam the entire world. At its core, the vampire myth endures because it touches something primal: the fear of death, the allure of immortality, the taboo of drinking blood, the predator who looks like us, who moves among us, who whispers to us in the dark. The vampire is the ultimate paradox, a creature we fear but cannot let go of. He is death wrapped in beauty, destruction cloaked in charm, horror disguised as romance. And so long as humans fear the night and long for eternity, the vampire will rise again. The vampire began as a whisper in Mesopotamian darkness. He became a nightmare in the Carpathians, an epidemic in Europe, a prince of blood in Wallachia. He rose from Vlad's cruelty, was reborn in Stoker's pen, and has danced across centuries of literature, film, and culture. He has worn many faces: monster, seducer, outcast, icon. But through it all, he has remained the same. A shadow that walks beside humanity, changing as we change, surviving as we survive. And so, the story of the vampire is not just a tale of the undead. It is the story of us. For in every age, in every land, the vampire is nothing less than our darkest reflection.